What to do when you're going through a midlife crisis? I think this is a question worth asking because it only affects 100% of all people. And thank you, Josephine from Holland, for writing in and asking this question. What can you do to help yourself when you're going through a midlife crisis, and how can we understand what it's all about? Well, that's a good question. Let's dive in. First off, I would suggest that understanding what's going on in a midlife crisis is one of the keys to actually helping ourselves through it. And why do we need to help ourselves through it? Well, it's called a crisis for a reason. So by definition, when we're going through the midlife crisis, we feel overwhelmed. Things are coming into our life, or changes are smashing into us that we didn't expect. Thus, it registers as a crisis. Now, I would consider a midlife crisis to be a very sacred passageway in our life. It's a rite of passage. Essentially, in a nutshell, my opinion on it is when we're going through the midlife crisis, we're burning, that's crisis of my language here, we're burning away who we're not, so the miracle of who we actually are can more fully arise. So it's a rebirth. You say, well, JP, a rebirth, that's a little bit of a worn out cliche. Try being a little creative. Well, I'll try harder next time. But with the rebirth analogy, for me, it's incredibly accurate. And I'm going to ask you to consider during your first life crisis, which I think was your birth, imagine what that would have been like. What kind of crisis was that when you were being born? If you just imagine, there you are, your fetus self. There you are, the little baby inside of your mother. You're in the home that you've grown into. It's comfortable. It's the only home you've ever known. So there you were, loving it, very identified with it all. And then something happened. A force of nature started to push you out of that womb. You may not have liked it, but it was a force of nature that was contracting harder than what we could resist. Thus, it's a crisis. We're overwhelmed by it. So there we are, getting pushed further and further into a rebirth through the birth canal. Into the birth canal. We're not through it yet. We're fighting it. We're kind of upset about it. And I would guess we were afraid. We were scared for our life. We could have sworn, as a little baby, I'm getting pushed into the birth canal, we're going towards a certain death. But as life continued to push us out of what we thought was our life, it actually ended up pushing us into something greater than what our life was. It pushed us into what our life is to be. But we had to go through that crisis in order for our life and ourself to expand. So the challenge of a midlife crisis is we don't have the birth canal and all the gross amniotic fluid to recognize, oh, I'm going through a rebirth. We have the crisis, the contractions of life pushing us out of who we've been, who we thought we've been, pushing us out of what we've been doing. And those contractions, they might be divorce, they might be job loss, they might just be depression, it might be serious health challenges. They are contractions of life, forcing us out of the mindset and self-identity set that we've been subscribed to. We don't like it, just like any baby doesn't like being pushed out of the comfortable place of its existence. Yet it's important to have it happen. There's a couple of responses. I'll call it two primary responses to a midlife crisis, at least the initiation of the contraction of it. One is we go with it. Sounds easy. We'll talk more about that. It's not easy, not my opinion. The second response is we progressively shut ourselves down more and more, so that we're essentially dead before we reach the other side of the birth canal. So it's a literal, if not metaphoric, way of killing ourselves so we don't have to be scared to death as we're being born into our new life, a grander version of ourself and our life. And of course, my invitation for you would be to go the awakened path. Go with it rather than progressively diminishing yourself, shutting yourself down just to save yourself the pain, discomfort, fear, and the unknown of what's on the other side of the birth canal of your midlife crisis. So, I'd also ask you to consider there's two primary phases of life. The midlife crisis is the rite of passage, bridging us from phase 1 to phase 2. Phase 1, it's all about building a sense of self. And that sense of self phase, which is usually the proverbial first half of life, which may be chronologically about halfway through life, and sometimes it's a little quicker, sometimes it's a little longer. The linear time, in my opinion, is not important. So when we're in this first half of life, things are important to us that probably just aren't going to be important to our future self. But we need to honor them when we are in the first half of our life. So we're doing a lot of things like creating a sense of self, and that's done partly through status. We learn to find a sense of being valued in the world, from the world. So look at me, here's my credentials, here's how wonderful I am, here's why I matter. We get pretty hungry for power and control. I'm not judging it to be a bad thing, I'm judging it to be a necessary thing to an extent. So we build up that sense of self in the first half of life. And then the midlife crisis starts. And that's the transition, it's the birth canal into our wide open second half of life. Second half of life, from my point of view in a nutshell, it's all about growing out of who we've been so that we can step into who we're becoming. The values that satiated us in the first half of life, who I am, status, build up that sense of self. Now we're actually all about shattering our sense of self. Status, not as important to me anymore. This is, you've probably seen or been that person, or watched movies where there's the proverbial successful person, and he or she maybe has outer world success, lots of money, lots of cars, family. And then one day he or she wakes up, and he or she really wakes up, not just out of bed, but wakes up to, this stuff isn't important to me. It isn't touching me deeply, and I have some kind of hunger inside. And no matter what how much food from the first half of my life I feed myself, it's not satiating this hunger. So this is waking up to shattering our sense of self. What we've become is now our chief obstacle in our midlife crisis. The more we resist letting go of who we were and what we've become, the harder it is. The more we let go, the scarier it is. Build our sense of self, first half of life. Shatter that sense of self in the midlife crisis so that we can have a much bigger, truer, more authentic sense of self in the second half of life. And you might be saying, JP, if that's true, it's kind of pointless. Why go through the first half of life, build a sense of self that's essentially who you're not, so you can then realize who you actually are in the second half of life? Why not just graduate right off the bat into who you actually are? Well, I think we are the ones in control of how fast that happens. Yet at the same time, I think it's necessary to go through who we're not. The caterpillar has to spin the cocoon before it can go beyond the cocoon into becoming the butterfly. We need to grow into a sense of self before we can grow beyond that sense of self. Of course, our reactive mind that just wants to avoid pain and wants to outsmart life, figure out how we can bypass that pain. It's like saying, how can you be born without ever going through birth? Whether it's through the birth canal or C-section, which is probably scarier. It's my hypothesis. I'll check my voice recording records from when I was a baby. Lost those, though. The point goes on. In our second half of life, what else is there to consider? Well, I'd ask you to essentially consider something new is being asked of you. I'm not talking from outside people. I'm going to get a little artsy-fartsy here and say something from your own damn soul is being asked of you, and it's a new asking. Perhaps your soul or your heart, it's wanting something new to live through you. And the best we can do in our second half of life is learn to allow it. So that can tell us and help us understand that in our second half of life, and therefore to help us through the contracting birth pains of our midlife crisis, that can tell us that what we're devoted to, what's important to us, what our values are, they're changing. And it might be very dramatic. I had a man in a workshop one time. He spent years as a very successful banker. And in his midlife crisis, he figured out, I want to just connect to people. And he became a flight attendant. What he was devoted to, what you and I are devoted to, it will likely change. You say, well, what is it? What's the change going to be? I would dare say, at best, only you know that. I think it's whispered through an incredibly soft, subtle voice inside of you. And at the very least, even if what you're devoted to doesn't change, you say, oh, my job, my relationships, all that's good. I don't want to change anything. And I'm being real. It's not just a fear mechanism saying, I don't want to change anything. But genuinely, you might say, I don't want to change any of that. Then maybe for you, what is changing is why. Why you're devoted to what you're devoted to. What if you found out, let's pretend you're in the healing profession. And what if you found out first half of your life, one of the significant whys you were in the healing profession is gave you a sense of power. Look how great I am. I get to help other people. In the second half of life, what if that reasoning, that value that drove your devotion to the healing profession, what if that burns away and it's replaced with a different value that can say with more authenticity, I'm in the healing profession to connect with people and help them help themselves. The power, the status that was once important and appropriately so to my younger self, it's genuinely not as important to me anymore. So in the second half of life, it's kind of like whatever it is we do, painting, business, reading, raising children, in the second half of life, it's kind of like if nobody ever saw us doing what we're devoted to, we'd be a lot more okay with it. We're a lot more okay if we don't get the world's validation, because I believe we're inherently at a time in our life, in the second half of life, where we're much more connected with an inner sense of validation. Kind of our thirst is being quenched through the connection with our own life purpose, maybe even our own soul. So as you are walking in your midlife crisis, there's a cliff to walk off of. It's a cliff from the land you've known to what is to be, which is a complete mystery. And anytime we walk off a cliff and we don't know where the bottom is, we don't know if the bottom is there, we don't know what the bottom's made out of, if there even is a bottom, we step off that cliff into the unknown. You're not human if it doesn't scare you at least a lot. So I would actually dare say it helps us significantly when we give ourselves permission to be afraid in this scary rite of passage in our life, when we're taking a step off the cliff of who we've been, so we can go deeper into the mystery of who we are and who we will be. That fear that registers, to me, it's not anything to be medicated. It's not anything to be fought. It's not anything that we need to distract ourselves from. I believe we need to feel that fear in order to truly allow ourselves to step off the cliff. And then I would also invite all of us to consider the idea of listening. I mentioned earlier that something new is being asked of us as we're going into our second half of life. What wants to live through us, it's changing, or it's getting bigger, or it's just coming through with more authority. So our job is to do our best to listen. Be meditative once in a while. Trust thyself rather than first half of life where we're unconsciously and also consciously taught, trust everybody else, trust your parents. Don't do anything unless you have outside validation. So we're taught to not trust ourselves. Second half of life, trust thyself. Listen to what the voice says inside, what it wants from you. And the voice probably doesn't speak in English or whatever language I'm actually talking right now. It's J-Pinglish. It probably speaks through feelings. And it may speak in a sense of, okay, I get fear and excitement when I go towards this potential new decision or new way of doing things. And I feel diminished when I go in this other direction of safety or the other choice. I get diminished, low energy. That may be how we listen. Listen to what enlivens you. What are the feelings of enlivening? And when do they come about? Enlivening is always coupled with the light and shadow. The light side of excitement, shadow side of fear. We can't have one without the other. A lot of us in our midlife crisis, we feel no excitement. We're like, yeah, I checked my pulse. I'm actually alive, but I feel dead inside. I just don't feel aliveness. What we're really saying when we're in that place is, I don't feel excitement. And that probably means I'm incredibly defended towards the mystery path, where the language that talks to me, it talks to me in the excitement and fear language. The more I avoid that, the more I progressively feel dead, unlively. And if we notice our deadness and unliveliness and just not excited, life is boring and mundane, and sooner or later I'll be fertilizing the ground. When we're in that place, that too is language speaking to us. It's essentially maybe the subtle, soft voice inside saying, this isn't the best path for you. I think the midlife crisis is always us walking through a transition into the best path for us, at least in that moment. So are you willing to do your best to go through a conscious rebirth? Burn away who you've been so you can become who you are. Are you willing to be afraid as you step off the cliff of your familiarity, sense of self and what you do? And you step into the mystery. Are you willing to be afraid? As opposed to being afraid to be afraid, which means we back up so far from the edge of the cliff that we don't even see that there is a cliff anymore. Are you willing to listen and be curious for the subtle, silent inner voice that's usually registered through feelings that guides us to new values, new passions, new devotions in life, and at the very least, new whys, why we do what we do and why we are who and what we are. Are you willing to do your best to listen to that voice? With that said, I really appreciate you entertaining these ideas on how to understand and go through a midlife crisis. And the other thing I'd invite you to do in your midlife crisis is subscribe to my channel, and I'll be talking to you next time.